This is the model I'm using. I have my reference up. It's a really beautiful photo, beautiful pose. Her name is Elisa, and I've used her before in one of my old sculptures. It was a reclining pose. And so far, we have established a little bit of the sculpture. A lot of times when you're looking and trying to sculpt, people go in for the details way too early. It's better to take your time, look at reference, look at anatomy charts, and understand what's underneath the skin. So I'm doing things slowly, and I think I've seen artists work much faster than me. And this is the second session that I have sculpted, and I've seen people finish things within like hours. I'm not that person. It takes me a lot longer to do something. So I'm going to add a little bit more fat here. There's a lot of things that you have to keep in mind, but usually in painting, the shadows kind of reveal the form, but on this, you have to kind of rely more on the anatomy. So as I move around, I'm constantly trying to redraw everything and remodel it. This is the tool that I'm using most of the time, and it does dry. All the clay does dry pretty often on there. So let's say if I wanted to make this a little bit smoother, one of the things that I do is I take the concave part of the sculpture tool, the modeling tool, and I'll take it and I'll just kind of curve it. And I'll curve it along with the form. One of the things that I do see people do that I don't like is they'll take some water and they'll just do this. And even though it might seem good when you fire it, that's not a very good sort of structure. In a way, it's better to keep things nice and flat as opposed to extremely smooth. Your goal as a sculptor should not be about making things smooth, but there is a style of sculpture that is very smooth. It's just I prefer a more classical approach. Now I'm looking at her profile. So if I'm looking at the lines, I'm also keeping in mind what is happening. So when I add a little bit of clay, I know that this part needs to be more round. But don't look at sculpture as a artificial sort of generic thing, because otherwise you're not going to give any life to your sculpture. So I'm going to keep working on this and just trying to manipulate the form. See if I use this tool, I can round it off and it becomes a little bit better than using your finger. But you constantly have to ask yourself, does this need to be a little bit taller? And yeah, it does. And I took a little bit off, but I keep using my tool to kind of push it down. And only towards the end, I'll use maybe a cloth or something to kind of clean it up. Beginning parts of sculptures, there's a lot of possibilities. So you want to look for the bottom of the 10th rib. It'll poke out a little bit on the side, and if you move the model around to a 3/4 profile, you'll see it poke out a little bit here. And the 10th rib is the one that is visible. Even though we have 12 thoracic ribs, vertebrae, the 10th one is the one that stands out the most. So one of the things that you want to do is kind of draw the shape of that rib cage and the very bottom. And you can kind of feel this in yourself too. This depression here would be where the external oblique and the rib cage are. And on her, I can see a very faint rib cage. And because she does have a little bit more fat, it's still visible. So one of the things I'll do is I'll create it a little bit more prominent. This way, when I go over and I try to create it nice and subtle, I'll have, I'll have that as reference. But you have to constantly be moving around. So at this point, I'm like looking at my model, and she doesn't have all of this here. And so that means that I'm going to take this tool and I'm going to make this part just a little bit, because so there's going to be a line here, Then you have the abdominals on each side, but here, there's going to be a little bit less. And then on both sides, I have it on this side. That's why I like this wire tool. I can remove that and kind of brush and smooth things without being too smooth. Also keep in mind when she is actually not touching the ground, the very bottom part here is actually right about here, and I can indicate it just by kind of doing this. And this part, I'm still going to attach it to the ground just yet because there is a negative shape inside here, but you don't want to remove it just yet. That's a little bit more of the engineering part of sculpture. You want to keep this with clay, otherwise if you have a negative shape in here, it's going to start drying the sculpture. You don't have to worry with oil-based clay, but for this sort of wet water-based clay, you do need to worry about these little things. It's not too much. It's just you get used to engineering things. So with the chest, there's going to be a little bit more of a depression here because we want to indicate the breasts on top of the rib cage. And if I do this, you see, just by doing this, there's like a triangle. It's on these sections, there are fosses. It's a depression under the clavicle and the pectoralis. I have it more prominent on that side. And it also helps to indicate where her nipples are and even draw like a line this way to see if one is higher than the other, because that's going to reveal the shoulder positions as well. And it's really nice that PostSpace gave us quite a few different vantage points. That really makes our life much easier. So right about here, we're going to have the pit of the neck. I'm going to indicate that. The pit of the neck, of course, is going to have on one side the sternocleidomastoid, and this part is going to be a little bit of depression. I've actually indicated this quite a bit. Now I am missing a little bit of the back of the head, but I'm not worried about that just yet. So I just want to keep moving around. It would be nice if in the future I had some sort of way of moving the sculptures or the reference. That's something that you do in a class. In a sculpture class, you have the model, and the model like moves every 20 minutes. Usually like it's an artist that moves it. And you do go through a lot of clay with this sort of system. The clay gets heavy, but one of the things that we're going to do in midway is hollow out our sculpture. That means that whatever is inside, we can remove and use for another sculpture. All of this inside, we're going to kind of scoop out. So I'm always asking myself, is this little line here too sharp? And it is. So I add a little bit of clay. I take my tool and I kind of like round it off. You can even do this to create a little bit of the roundness to the figure. And of course, there's this line here. Then there's a little bit more padding here. Female models are always harder to sculpt. And this is a great pose. Like, this is a beautiful pose that they gave us, like a close-up of the face. I am not worried too much about that yet. Probably the only thing I'm going to be doing is like indicating the midway. Now, I think I'm just going to move back a little bit. If you're first starting out sculpting, you're better off sculpting a male figure, but many people just choose to do females. But I think that's a little bit of a rougher thing to do because females are a lot harder to understand anatomy. Not that they have less muscles, they just, the muscles are not as prominent. And when you have muscles that are subtle, subtlety is very difficult to do. But it's always challenging to do. So there's a little shape here, right here, bottom of the rib cage. The shapes of the hips get very wide, and there's a lot of stuff happening in the thighs. So right here with the hand, we're going to take some new clay, kind of wrap it, because my hand here, I haven't attached it to the ground because only your fingers are actually touching the ground. Her palm is definitely like a lot higher, but what I'm going to do is connect it to the ground and make it solid. And this might look a little bit strange because otherwise her hand is going to look massive. But that is fine because I just don't want it to dry completely. And if you were to look at it, her wrist is actually here, and then her palm or her knuckles are here. So I am just going to make it a little bit wider. And from this point forward is just going to be her fingers, but we're just massing everything in. At this point, it does make sense to have different tools for the job. I'm going to keep this flat one because I want to get it into this area that's very difficult to get to. And her arm, it takes like a tool like this, you can kind of push the entire arm where you want it to go and then kind of take care of the thigh. But you want to make it nice and thick and rounded. One of the things that people do struggle, including me, is sculpting the back of the arm because it's so hidden. And her arms are pretty thin and long. You want to be able to kind of take your tool. This is why you have a modeling tool. That's why these are modeling tools. You can go around the figure, even if it's you don't see it on, even the parts that you don't see, you should sculpt them as well. So here in the thigh, you have the knee. That's why I like this kind of tool. You can take and just make very large movements. So this is the sartorias here on the inner part, and it gets bunched up because she is sitting on her legs. There's a lot of things happening, but what I like to do is round off the sartorias first, and then I'll take a different tool, maybe this one, kind of just start rounding off the leg. So here's her knee, her patella bone. This should be more off to the side. And my favorite muscles are the vastus medialis and lateralis. So the medialis is here on the inner part, and the lateralis a little bit further up the thigh. And on this side, you'll see that I've already indicated a little bit of that. The sartorias is very visible here on her. The less fat somebody has, the more you'll see that, but most people have it very prominent on their legs. It's very easy to look for. It's a good muscle to look for. It's also called the tailor's muscle because it runs crisscross the leg, and I guess tailors and seamstresses in the past used to cross their legs, I guess, when they were making stuff. So that's why it's called the sartorias, known as the tailor's muscle. I don't know who really came up with that, but it must be true. Also keep in mind how wide the leg needs to be. And right here, this vastus lateralis, which is the side muscle, is a lot more powerful. And I find that women do have more powerful legs. At least they're more defined than a lot of guys. Usually when male models pose, they're defined, but I find that a lot of models throughout areas tend to do a lot of exercising. It really depends, but. So if you can see, I'm using my tool in a very different way. I kind of round things off. I push it in and then I slide it the way I want the curve to go. Very flat like this. And even like put it down and see where it hits along the figure. Make sure it's sharp. I think a lot of times one of the mistakes I make is that I put things too short and then I don't want to push them back in, but you should kind of try and make it. In the beginning, you definitely have the chance to move things around. Don't get too committed with your gesture. Remember, gestures and sculptures are a lot harder. It's been a lot harder to figure things out as I move along. So let's move the sculpture around. So right here in the breast, I want to curve it a little bit. So now I'm pushing up and out. And I'm just kind of curving it. Make sure that your tool is nice and clean. If it's not, it's going to be much more difficult to do. So I'm looking around. This arm needs to be bigger. I don't think I've worked too much on this arm, so I'll probably work a little bit on it. So this arm also needs to be rounder. And here is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus right here. There's a lateral and a medial section to everything. So when I say lateral, it's always on the outside of the body. The brachioradialis is here. And it's usually like a little bit fuller here, and it crisscrosses the body or the arm. So if you know that, you can take your clay and just simply move it around the body, because the muscles are here and they attach to the medial condyle of the radius and the ulna right here. So if you keep that in mind, a lot of the muscles that go from the the elbow just go to the wrist. They don't attach anywhere else. So when you have that in mind, you can kind of put things. So right here, there's an extensor digitorum that goes to the wrist as well, to the digits. But you can see a little bit on this model, even though she's hard to see, but that's the reason you would have a male model instead. These little muscles would be much easier to see. You can also hold up your arm and see it. So right there, that's the epicondyle, and all the muscles, if I twist, they're all moving to the wrist. And you can exaggerate this a little bit if you want a little bit more dynamic movement. Don't be one of these people that sculpts as if they paint. It's very important to do things according to anatomy knowledge. And you should always have a reference up if you can. I know it's a lot of work to learn anatomy, but it's one of these things that people just don't want to do. A nice big tool like this and just kind of rock it back and forth. You can mush it into the previous clay that you put down. Okay. Let's step back and look at it.